My name is Laura Lee, and I manage our Tenement Talk series here at the Tenement Museum. I'm really excited to have you all here. I want to thank you all for coming. I know we have some members who are in the audience, so thank you for staying involved with the Tenement Museum. This month, November, we've been leaning in a lot to what it means to be politically active and how everyone kind of expresses that in very different ways. And so we have an opportunity tonight to look at that from I think, a really interesting perspective on what it means to kind of make yourself visible politically, put yourself out there, especially when you are undocumented, and that may make you vulnerable for many different reasons. And so tonight we'll be talking about the issues and the challenges and how these communities are speaking up for themselves and also taking care of themselves. So I'm going to pass it off to our esteemed panel. I'm going to hand the microphone to our moderator, Sofia Opticore, and our guests are going to introduce themselves. We will have time at the end of the discussion for your questions and comments. So please participate in the conversation. I know this group is ready to engage with you all. So thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sofia Opticore. I'm in the Sociology and Critical Ethnic Studies Department at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I'll just be moderating and asking questions of these amazing panelists, so I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you to Laura for bringing this all together, and for folks here on the panel. I'm excited to share space with you all. My name is Kevin Escudero. I'm an assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown. And my research broadly looks at areas of immigration, race, social movements, and law.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me. My name is Ronnie. I'm the New York State DreamAx Fellow with Unlocal, as well as the New York City chapter lead for the Undocumented Black Network. My work is rooted in the community, and that community is immigrants. So here to support that and be present.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angie. I am co-executive director at the New York State Youth Leadership Council. We're an undocumented youth-led organization on Canal Street, so not that far from here. And I'm excited to be here. I'll tell you a little bit more about me later.
So I would like to start by acknowledging that the Tenement Museum is on a traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people. And I also hope that our conversation today about immigrant organizing can engage with some of the settler colonialist legacies of this land. This being said, I want to move to our first question, which is in two parts. One, it would be really great if you could share how you came to be involved in organizing for immigrant rights, what that involvement has looked like for you, but also what have been some barriers and challenges that you've seen immigrant community members, particularly undocumented immigrants, face in resisting the unjust immigration system in the U.S. We don't have to go in order, whatever order you want to go to.
Could I have the question one more time, please?
So tell us how you became involved in organizing for immigrant rights.
Okay.
And then what are some of the barriers and challenges you faced?
So I got into organizing mostly out of survival. I'm a DACA recipient, and organizing for a lot of people like myself is the way that we're able to create pathways out of our oppression, or be able to actualize our power and make lasting or concrete steps towards a life for ourselves. So I got into organizing because of that. And I stick because there's still so much work to be done. And to be very transparent, because I'm still in the status that I am in. A lot of this work hinges on the fact that there is no ability to adjust, and the fact that there is still no ability is the reason why I'm still doing this.
I also got involved in immigrant rights organizing out of survival. I was undocumented for over 20 years, and when I was in high school, I realized that I wasn't eligible for federal financial aid, and that was going to keep me from financing my way through college, and I mostly got involved at first selfishly because I thought it was unfair. I wanted to go to school, and my teachers had like exploited me all of my high school life, doing all these extracurricular activities, getting all these good grades, because that was supposed to be enough to get me through college, and it wasn't. And so, like Ronnie said, political organizing allowed me to find a voice for myself and to take control over my life in the aspects that I could. Being undocumented made it really difficult for me to plan long term, to plan like 1-year goals, 5-year goals, but organizing gave me the opportunity to think about a future, to think about hope, to think about like a better world and the things that I deserved that were basic human rights, but are often seen as like asking for too much, right? And so that I was about 17 when I got involved in immigrant rights organizing, and it's been challenging for a lot of different things. Of course, being too young, every time we do anything, people think that I'm too young to know about stuff, right? At this point, I've been organizing for over 10 years. I've already seen like different iterations of the Federal Dream Act fail, the New York State Dream Act failed. We've organized buses to DC and people still question my ability to do things. And then of course, being like a woman, I always have to defend myself a lot more, especially now in my role as a director of a nonprofit organization that's fairly small and not fully funded like other organizations. And then a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric, a lot of mental health issues that are often unaddressed, and we can't access services the way everybody else does. And so it's hard to try to build political capacity when folks are like struggling with depression, suicidal ideation, and all these other things, right? Or if folks decide to just leave, right, self-deport, or migrate somewhere else, and there's no support for a lot of these other things and other ways to survive.
So my mom is a refugee from Vietnam. She had Vietnamese and Cambodian, and my dad's an immigrant from Bolivia, from South America, and I grew up in LA, or the greater LA area. So being multiracial and coming from an immigrant and refugee family and background, I think we talked about these issues a lot. It was something that I saw kind of my parents' generation deal with, but I went to UCLA for undergrad, which is a large public institution in Southern California, and there were other students who were undocumented, and so I really started to understand, you know, what is it like for my really good friend or my roommate or somebody in an organization with me to be undocumented and to have to kind of deal with the ramifications of their status in all these different ways. And that made it a little bit more relatable for me. In that context. And at the time, UCLA was a space where people were organizing for the DREAM Act, the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, which would have, if passed, kind of given a path to citizenship for folks, even though we know that it has some limitations with the education pathway or the military service pathway. And so people were really organizing around that, and I started getting involved just as a fellow student, as a peer, as a child of immigrants. And I have extended family members who were undocumented at the time, and so it was a way to kind of make my education relevant and meaningful to the communities that I care about and that I'm a part of.
Some of you brought up these barriers and challenges in doing this work, and I wanted to also ask you how both you as individuals, but also collectively in the movement, work with these barriers and challenges in fighting for justice. I know that's a big question.
So I guess some of the work that we've done to combat some of these barriers has been, well, participating in like political advocacy things, right? Mobilizing for different legislation to pass, pushing for the New York State Dream Act. I don't know if you all are familiar, but this year, our state has opened up tuition assistance support for all people, regardless of their immigration status. So that includes undocumented people, people with U visas, and other kinds of statuses. And that was one way that we challenged our state government to combat at least one area of financing your education and partnering up with other organizations to support us either with legal services or mental health counseling services for folks. The demand, though, has gone up a lot, at least for us. We work with a lot of young people that are oftentimes eligible for some kind of immigration relief, and the backlog is making it hard for people to get appointments. I don't know if, like, everybody's getting screened or there's, like, a lot of fear, but the wait times are really high, so it's been a challenge to even find resources in our city, which is super immigrant friendly. And creating our own opportunities has been also a way for us to combat things. So we've raised our own money for our own scholarship programs, mobilized our own communities to like stop our members' deportations, or raising money for their own bail, because we've had like folks bail up to $15,000 for their family members in detention. So we've had to create our own opportunities and strategize around how to protect each other in these kinds of scenarios.
I think I want to piggyback on that last portion that Angie touched on. Just a general means of accessibility for being undocumented to being somewhat documented to being a citizen. Those are different. Those look different, and if you put them together, they don't make sense. They going by status. The distinctions that are made, it clearly shows that being born here and being a foreigner are two very different things, and it shows in the accessibility that we have. And I think with New York specifically, the nonprofit complex that we do have, there is just so much little. There's so little in terms of what is allocated for immigrants. And we are told that we have to fight for it. We're told that we have to, we're told so many things about accessing this little amount, and then we are denied when we create these pathways for ourselves, such as DACA. A lot of us want to think that it's President Obama who gave DACA out to us. It's really not. It took a lot of action from community organizations on the federal level and on the state level, like YLC. It's consistently being in these positions. So I think that's how we are moving past barriers. That's how we are breaking barriers, by honestly putting our bodies on the line where we think that we can plug in and where it can mitigate the most amount for our community, whilst balancing how much will that hurt ourselves and our families. So I think that's the general thing that immigrants are doing, figuring out how much of my body can I put on the line? How much is it worth? What can I spend my body on? And will that mean that I'm no longer present in the U.S.?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, kind of echoing what you all shared. One thing that's really impressed me about the undocumented immigrant movement is that folks have been very vocal about fighting for people who may not fit within this framework of this is a case that could be won, or this is somebody who has someone, because I think organizations have limited capacity, and so sometimes attorneys' time is devoted to people who have a clear-cut case. And I think what I've really appreciated is that communities are working at a grassroots level to fight to stop the deportations of folks in a very kind of like, because they're a community member, because they're a family member, because they're somebody that contributes in that way, not necessarily kind of a state-based, this is a high-achieving person or student or worker, et cetera. So I think kind of that's one thing. I mean, even just like accompanying people to court, as y'all mentioned, like fundraising, I think it's really working against quote-unquote like mainstream ways that people see worthiness. So yeah, I think a lot of organizations have done that, and civil disobediences and political actions as kind of pushing against these barriers to show the ways in which that they're contradictory or the logics are flawed, and being really strategic and purposeful about that.
I'm going to pick on you a little bit, Kevin, because I don't think that you told us that you have a book coming out on the subject, right? So, so just tell us, like, you talk to a lot of people who are doing this work, right? So you're sharing not just as a participant, but also as a researcher. Just say a few words about this book. What's the name of the book?
Yeah, sorry about that. So the book is called Organizing While Undocumented. It's coming out with NYU Press in March of 2020. It's a book that I think connects the experiences of undocumented activists and kind of the ways in which they're speaking to the larger political landscape in the US and the world. I make the argument that undocumented folks, what I found from talking to people doing ethnography in different cities and being in San Francisco, Chicago, and then talking to some folks here in New York, is that the conversation is really on intersectional identities. So yes, the immigration status or immigration status is very important and it affects people's lived experiences in many different ways, but that being queer, being a person of color, being from a particular area was also important, and folks brought that up a lot. And as somebody that is mixed, I talk to folks who identify as Asian and undocumented, as Latinx and undocumented, really trying to see the different identities and kind of perspectives that people had, because I felt like sometimes while activists were really active on highlighting those narratives, it wasn't as well highlighted in the literature, perhaps. So, so as somebody that kind of tries to bridge the academic and the activist spaces, that was something I wanted to contribute, or I saw the work contributing. Yeah.
All right, great. Actually, the point that you were making about worthiness kind of brings me to the next question. So just to give a little bit of a background, and I think that this happens in other social movements as well, but a lot of times arguments for immigrant rights are framed in terms of immigrants deserving these rights, based on willingness to work hard in crappy jobs, being law-abiding, being members of heteronormative families, in the case of undocumented youth, being innocent, right? Parents brought you over the border, you didn't make that decision yourself. And these arguments are sometimes effective or sometimes not effective, but they're always excluding undocumented immigrants or immigrants generally who do not conform to these criteria. And I want us all to reflect on other ways of talking about and fighting for immigrant rights, because I know all three of you have done a lot of work in this area. So in other words, what are the alternatives to doing that? Because it's quite common to kind of make appeals for immigrant rights because immigrants are hard workers, or because, picking up on what makes them deserving.
I guess one thing I really appreciated was some of the folks that I talked to. So my project started in 2009 and it kind of wrapped up around 2017, 2018, but I still talk to folks and keep in contact. And what was really interesting to see was that people that I started talking to, I'm a college student, I'm undocumented, I'm not quite sure what the opportunities are. Maybe now we have, so then later DACA came, later there were, state level DREAM Acts or policies or nonprofit organizations that increase in resources. And now folks are undocumented attorneys and physicians and professionals, teachers, and I think that they're really pushing the conversation in a way that, continuing to push that conversation in I'm your teacher and I'm teaching your children, but I'm undocumented and I don't have access to particular things. Like my funding is reliant on a foundation or not a public, school district. And so I think I've been really humbled by that and seeing the ways in which undocumented attorneys are representing other undocumented folks in the courtroom, yet they very much grapple with the same issues that their clients are grappling with. And so I think one thing that I found really inspiring about the movement and about the work of people that I've had the opportunity to talk to is that they're really showing the limitations of this legal logic and the legal system and this notion of rights in the US and how it's predicated on a particular kind of inclusion that is meant to exclude many, many people, in particular like a lot of the folks that are immigrants to this country. And so yeah, I guess just kind of showing and highlighting those contradictions or the limitations. So even if we give inclusion to all, undocumented folks, there's still going to be perhaps challenges because of the way that might be implemented or et cetera. But I just found that to be really important is the way people are highlighting the logic and the contradictory nature of it.
So I think one of the biggest things is always holding things together and showing them a mirror image or something. So what I like to do is putting things like policy, how would that apply for an undocumented person, and how does it apply for a US citizen, or how does it apply for a resident? Does that make sense that we have different laws governing potentially the same people, especially when immigrants given the proper channels, have access to becoming naturalized. So if we have processes like this, it does not make sense to govern in different ways, especially just because someone came out from a different country. So it's just looking at things like that, making sure that we are always existing at the same time and not seeing things as separate from each other. When really and truly everything is intersectional, and that's the way that I try to orient my organizing. Intersectionality is essentially the theory that everything is connected, and that oppression is linked, and it's not just a straight it's not a straight pathway oppression. It affects us nuanced, and those nuances have different endpoints. And I feel like when you orient your organizing in that way, when you orient your politics in that way, you're thinking in a way that's not only about yourself, and making relevance to everyone in your context, or all the agents within your context. So when you organize, or when you orient your mindset that way, you're able to see folks not as undocumented, or the labels that have been socially subscribed to them. You're able to see them in their humanity. And that's where really policy in the United States, and if not the world, has failed. Recognizing the humanity of individuals, recognizing that a stringent border policy does not at all adhere to what humans have done historically, and that we migrate, we move. We need policy that is reflective of our humanity, reflective of ourselves, and that's just not there. And we also need to be very true with ourselves, and there isn't an inability to do this, there is an intentionality not to do this. Across the world, including the Caribbean, we have policies that mirror the ways that people move, such as CARICOM. If your country is a part of CARICOM, you can essentially move and work in any country that's part of CARICOM. A very layman's a breakdown of that, but that doesn't per se exist in a first world country like the United States. And there's an intent not for that. There's intent for that not to happen. And how you all can plug in as allies, or as the affected, is being present, honestly, with nonprofits. Nonprofits and community organizations, there's a little difference, but being very clear that if being in a space that centers the people that you're working for, the people that you want to, and being a space that prioritizes individuals, and the impacted individuals.
I think one way that we try to challenge this idea of worthiness in our space has got to be tied to challenging our own racism and anti-Blackness. Because I think at the root of all of these ideas of worthiness is because you're trying to appeal to a certain white citizen gaze, and you're trying to get acceptance and approval from like white Americans that say you exist. And to get this approval, we like repeat a lot of narratives about I'm better than this immigrant, I have a good education, I have a career, I'm not a gang member, I don't have a criminal record, all these things that are, bad. And I think the key is political education, because it like disrupts and it challenges a lot of these things, and it teaches us that in the past, like so many immigrants before us, so many like Black folks before us have tried to appeal to this worthiness and still be like excluded, still be killed, still be shunned, still have second-class citizenship. And there's something to learn about that, right? That if folks in the past have tried to appeal to this idea of worthiness and it has not worked, why do we repeat, right? And repeat these narratives, repeat these stories. And I think for us, a deciding moment was after the Federal DREAM Act failed to pass in 2010. The DREAM Act was built on a lot of this high-achieving valedictorian stories. We went to rally in our cap and gowns and to say, I just want to go to school, I want a better life. And our government like slapped us in the face, right? It didn't pass. And when we came back to our state, it pushed us to be more politicized, right? And to think about like, why was it that all of these things we did meant nothing to this country, right? To this government. And we decided to become more vocal about the things that we cared about, that we were told to be quiet about because they were shameful. Folks' sexual identity, gender identities. We started listing out in our organization, like, what are the things that we value and we want other people to value in our space. And if these things go against our values, we're gonna call them out. And we put all of that on a piece of paper, and the things that came up was like, some of us had like police interactions, had family members that had been detained or deported, and oftentimes we were told we couldn't talk about that, right, because it made us look bad, because it made the immigrant struggle look bad, and we were like, you know what, fuck that, like, this is the reality of what it means to be undocumented in the United States, to be part of mixed status families. Some people are queer, some people are trans, some people had police interactions, some people smoke pot, and that's okay, and that doesn't make you like less deserving of human rights. And so then we had to change a lot of our curriculum. We changed the way that we organized young people. Most of our political education workshops are for like high school students. So it's the high school age where they start learning like what is racism, what is sexism, because something that happens in a lot of political spaces, I think we just expect people to know. So we try to have like introductory workshops where folks can challenge these ideas because they come to our space and repeat the things that they heard from us, right? Older folks that were like, this is the way that you have to exist to be accepted here. And so we try to have those conversations to challenge these things so that when they see it in their class, right, or when their teacher tells them, you just have to work really hard to get XYZ, they know that's not the way things are actually happening in our community. So it's a lot of like challenging yourself, I think, that you're able to then build more solidarity and work with other groups and spaces, and folks then like are also forced to create their own spaces because of that racism. Like UndocuBlack is a younger organization and has had to be created because of that constant push out and exclusion that exists in other immigrant spaces.
Thank you for that answer, Angie. It was great to hear about. Actually, speaking of UndocuBlack and thinking intersectionally, how do you see the immigrant rights movement working together, connecting with other social justice movements, you know, and think about it also in the U.S., but maybe we can also have a conversation globally. So I'm thinking yes, like Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ liberation, indigenous land struggles, but also Palestinian liberation or, you know, global climate justice movements. What does that look like?
I can give a bit more about what UndocuBlack is. UndocuBlack is a community organization filled with Black immigrants who are formerly and currently undocumented. And all we're about is figuring out how we can make our community live and actualize their best lives. So that really is all about fostering community. And in fostering community, you learn what the needs are. And once you learn the needs, you can actively fight for those needs. And you'd have folks who are rooted in that same struggle, who are willing to push the work for it. Like Angie said, we were born out of really the anti-Blackness that exists within the immigration movement. And a lot of that is in line with the respectability politics that a lot of this is in line with respectability politics that say you have to act a certain way to be recognized as a human being. So for a lot of Black immigrants, we come to this country with the idea that you have to wear your Sunday best or be as close to the Sunday best to be seen, or really more. We're marketed that you really have to be your Sunday best to get a pathway to citizenship. That's really it's true in the same way that dreamers are marketed that the only way you can get your citizenship is by being a dreamer, by being the star of your school, which a lot of us are not. Like, that's a lot of work. And was anybody in this room valedictorian? Okay, don't expect it from us. Like, so like that expectation, like, again, like just mirroring undocumented communities with birth citizens, like what are the expectations? And you see the bullshit. I'm a little angry. Uh, so like this is kind of how Undocumented Black was born, and it's just to say that like no movement is perfect. We all have our nuances. There are nuances in every organization, in every movement, but how you circumvent that is being intentional about change, being intentional about the work that you're trying to push forward, and being intentional about your community. Ooh. Um, what was the other part of that question?
Working with other movements in the US and globally.
So I think the frame that UBN does is asserting that we are a Black organization, and these are our principles. And if you can't get with that, I'm sorry, you're not within our organizing frame. And it's not to, it is to exclude, but it's to exclude so our people can be able to participate and not feel unsafe. It's to create that space for immigrants that really has not existed, that really has not been in existence outside of organizations like Baji and the African communities together. So in that, facing a fair amount of anti-Blackness is just orienting that our politic is that the United States is a white supremacist nation, and the policies that come out of this will prop up white lives over people of color. And in all of that, there is a process that does pit along the color spectrum. The darker you are, the less recognized you are. And that's what we see within the immigration movement, a lot of colorism specifically. And circumnavigating that is just asserting like, this is my identity. Outside of that is knowing that our communities come from other places. So the issues that we face isn't just at the border. It is intervention. There's a whole lot going on that that I'm not very versed in. This isn't the regions that I'm from, but this is the news. It's all out there. This is what portions of my community are going through. My community, specifically the Caribbean, we're facing a shit ton of hurricanes because of the global north and the things that they're doing with the environment. Dominica specifically was 90% of the island was destroyed by Hurricane Maria, and is because of community action. The Dominica is now propped to be one of the first islands to be completely hurricane safe. This was not because of the actions of the global north. So again, it's just our communities taking, a portion of it is our communities taking action and responsibility for the things that the global north does because of inaction on the global sphere. Whether that be in politics or with the environment, there's a level of not being able to participate in it because of the borders of this country. But the intention, we're connected with our families. We're connected with our families. That's the main root for us all. And I think a big portion of this, I was in DC for the Home is Here actions, and something that was floated around was that I only know this national anthem. I don't know the one of my country. Well, a lot of us do. Like this is all things, and this is how we stay connected. And by staying connected with your families, we're able to know what's happening. And by knowing what's happening by a firsthand account, we're able to make moves such as barrels. Barrels are essentially packages that we send back home filled with goods and supplies for our family members. So that could be cans of tuna fish and what have you, or clothing. So that's how folks are being intentional about maintaining their presence home, creating a pathway for sustainability for folks who did not have the ability to migrate here, whether that be with or flying or coming through the border. Like people are staying connected just through their families a lot of times. Left, right?
I think ways to build solidarity. I think we have to, I've challenged myself to see myself also as an ally or an accomplice. Because I think when I first got involved in immigrant rights, well, one, I was young, right? So I think we we hold young people to like super high standards of wokeness that's unfair. But so, you know, I used to say like messed up things too. What was my main point? And so, yeah, we're all problematic, one. And so when I first got involved, I was undocumented, and a lot of the the focus, I think, for me was like always thinking about myself, my struggles, my impression. I can't do this because I'm undocumented. I can't do that because I'm undocumented, and it was a constant thing that I was always thinking about. And I think through political activism, it challenged me to think about how do I show up as an ally to other things, right? Like, sure, I'm undocumented, but I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not going through this, I don't experience this. And challenging myself to show up too. And I think that is something that we try to project in our space, to think about, yes, you go through this, but you can also show up in other ways. And that's something that I want to also challenge citizens to do, because I think a lot of the pushback that we've gotten in our activism from citizens has been like, well, you know, like I'm poor, so I struggle with this. And I'm just like, okay, we're trying to build a movement of solidarity and liberation, right? When we were advocating for the New York Dream Act in our state, we had moms that would come and protest us and say, well, my child is in debt, so your child shouldn't get free education. One, no one is getting free education because they can barely pay one person's tuition. And two, instead of thinking of ourselves as comrades fighting for access to education for all of our young people, right, all the students, it was this like pitting against each other thing that was happening. So I think something that we try to do is think about how do we show up as allies for other issues? Because oftentimes I think we would get stuck in like, people need to show up for me. And we don't think like, how do I show up for somebody else or another issue or another cause? And that means like Ronnie was saying, putting your body on the line when necessary, when asked, not as a saviory thing, right? If that means donating when you can, raising awareness about other organizations that maybe try to fill in the gap for the work that you don't do. So if that means uplifting undocumented Blacks' work, or if that means uplifting like trans queer liberation movements work, or Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, or other organizations that are also trying to fill in the gaps for all of these issues, because one group is not going to address all of them.
Sure. So one thing that I guess I've heard in conversation is a lot of folks talking about settler colonialism and how immigrant issues relate to settler colonial issues, and the self-determination of indigenous peoples and indigenous sovereignty rights. And that's not to say that there aren't indigenous migrants as well. And so having those conversations with some folks in different spaces has helped me think, or want to think more about that in conversation with folks. And I think I saw it come up with the travel ban, and a lot of indigenous activists saying that there's no travel ban on stolen land, right? That this is land that is a settler state, settler colonialism being this process through which folks come and take land to dispossess indigenous peoples and then replace the native with white nativists, right? And then use people of color as part of racial capitalism to make profit for the settler state. And so it's very violent, it's ongoing. And so one thing I've tried to do is, or thought about more, is my mom as a refugee from Vietnam went through Guam, and Guam is a US territory, and the indigenous community there, the Chamorro community, and laws look differently there. It's a territory not treated legally the same way, and so there's a decolonization movement happening in Guam, and it's a coalition between Asian settlers who are immigrants and refugees, kind of talking about what does it mean to be an immigrant and to be marginalized in this way, but then also to be privileged in relationship to the indigenous Chamorro communities whose territory and lands it is. And continues to be, but yet they're occupied by US military and US imperialism. So I've been spending some time talking with folks there and just learning from them of how, they talk about, like, there's shirts that I really like that say Filipinos for Chamorro self-determination. And it's been really humbling as somebody who's not Filipino and not Chamorro and, has the privilege of being a US citizen, but just to learn from the conversations that are happening and how folks are navigating those conversations, because I think they're really powerful. And there's folks doing work on the U.S.-Canada border, the U.S.-Mexico border of indigenous mobilities, and how indigenous migrants are also subjected to a lot of the similar practices that are perpetrated against undocumented folks who may not identify as indigenous. So I think that conversation has just been really inspirational for me, but it's something that I'm new to, and I'm just kind of asking the questions and seeing, you know, what I can learn and how I can be supportive in that space. But I think there's a lot of conversation, at least in academia, but also in communities, because I think academia, you know, will not always, but hopefully follow what communities are saying and doing and the lead that they're providing.
Thank you for those answers. So I'm going to pivot a little bit. So currently, the Supreme Court is deciding on the future of DACA. There's also a case that could potentially make just immigrant advocacy illegal, which is kind of frightening. So what do you think are kind of the next steps for the immigrant rights movement, given these developments? Or more generally in our current climate?
So the first thing that comes to mind is for representatives, don't sell out. Literally, do not sell out. People are either lobbying, I was in DC working on the Dream Dot, not the Dream Dot US, that's a scholarship. The Dream and Promise Act. Everything has dream in it. It's a little confusing. They usually, it's America. They do not, all they do is recycle. Like even oppression, like what you were, everything is recycled. Nothing is new. It just takes intention of like going back in history and plotting when one thing happened and looking at today. Nothing is new in America. I think one of the biggest things, the biggest challenges that we're having in DC is having just having representatives stick to what the community is asking for. So if we can have folks like, I'm not going to name names, but if we can just, if the most simple thing that you can do is just calling your representative, state, federal, local, letting them know that I'm with immigrants. It starts there, and I can guarantee you that, I can honestly guarantee you that there are immigrants on the Hill all fighting for this. So I feel like the things that you can do right now on a political level, you can pull out your phone right now and call your representative. If not, leave a message and express where you are politically, and they have to listen to you. And if they're not, you have a basis to get them out of power. It's what your power is as a U.S. citizen. You have a lot of voting power, especially in federal. If you have a lot of voting power in federal elections. We don't. That's where you can change the field for us. This is where you can use your body by going into an office and like saying, hey, this is what I want. This is where you can pick up the phone and call someone. This is where you can join me in a march and stand in front of me when the police come. Like, these are just little things.
I think because I work with mostly directly impacted communities, my thoughts are like the people who are going to be impacted by a negative Supreme Court outcome. And a lot of the young people that I work with are fearful that they may lose their deferred action status. Some folks have been talking about the real possibility of moving to another country. Some folks are thinking about dropping out of school because their careers are dependent on a work permit that will get them a license to be a teacher or a social worker. I've seen a lot of teacher, social worker youth. So there's just a lot more depression, feeling like all these years of XYZ are nothing. And then the last emergency community meeting that we had, I saw undocumented DACA recipients that had debt. They had mortgages, homes, cars. And if you lose DACA, you don't lose your debt. That was something that was my first question to the lawyer. I was like, do you still have to pay this debt? They were like, yes, like, duh. Like, they were looking at me like it was a dumb question. I'm like, this is a serious question. So there's folks that are like thousands of dollars in debt, right? That thought DACA would be a long-lasting thing. People have families, they have children, and so there's just a lot of stress about 2020 and also election cycle, right? So it's election and it's also a Supreme Court decision. So for us, we've been trying to combat some of this fear by centering folks that never qualified for deferred action. Because I think what happens is we forget that there was a lot of people that never even got to apply and are still navigating the world the past 7 years and are still semi-thriving or thriving or making it or hustling or whatever it is, right? So we created a entrepreneurship guide for non-citizens this year, and that is tailored to young people to learn how to engage in freelancing, the gig economy, entrepreneurship, creating their own LLCs, because a lot of them can monetize their hobbies. If it's graphic designing, if it's coding, if it's, there's a huge wave of freelancing and contracting work that non-citizens can engage in. They just have to pivot a little bit the way that they think about work and their career. And so we've been trying to challenge that by thinking about different ways to make a living and to be able to make money without a work permit. Not to say that that is at all the solution, right? Or that is even easy to think about, because the real, like the fear of losing your DACA is a real one, right? I don't want to say that it isn't. Yeah, so that's one way that we've been trying to challenge that. And a lot of our high school students are recently arrived migrants, so they also didn't qualify for deferred action. And so it's been a challenge, I think, to try to balance all the needs, because there's like the incoming Supreme Court decision that will impact DACA recipients, and then there's like a lot of young people that weren't eligible, that are still trying to be plugged in, but it feels like there's only support resources for DACA recipients. So it's like a juggling thing that we try to do to ensure that folks are getting the support that they need, and also that their voices are heard and that they feel represented and seen. But yeah, the Supreme Court decision is really stressful.
So, Ronnie, I really loved how you said that U.S. Loves to recycle oppression. And I was thinking about that because we're in a museum, right? The Tenement Museum, which is a lot about our history. And so I wonder what you think about the way that museums and or cultural institutions more broadly can support activism in the immigrant rights movement, but also to document it, if you have any ideas.
Okay, so I love museums. New York is like the city for museums. I'm a mess, don't judge me. Um, so I think museums being a place of history, offering community space. That's one thing that comes to mind a lot. Space is in New York City alone is a huge thing. And getting access to space can be incredibly difficult, especially when you want to meet to discuss maybe alternative political systems to the one that we're in, or realistic immigration reform. These may not always be spaces, spaces may just not be available to you. And I think being sites of history, you can honor history by making your space open, as well as be a place for history to start. A lot of movements start out of just one or three people, one or not three, but a few people meeting together to discuss, I got a ticket on the MTA, I don't like that. Like, why are there so many cops here? Like just getting to just having a space to discuss that can be integral and be a point for a lot of build out. As we can look at Martin Luther King, for example, for being one of a pretty big example of how movements start off so really small and can become something bigger. Would also like to highlight MLK would be nothing without Black women. as would Black Lives Matter and subsequently portions of our immigration movement. I would like to, I think that's where museums can really show up, honoring history and being a place where history can essentially flourish and start.
I think museums can show up by commissioning undocumented artists to highlight their work and get paid, can raise funds for undocumented organizations and people, can donate proceeds from all the things that they do, could host space, host fundraisers, host events, can just create space for art to exist, and dialogues like these are a great start too.
Yeah, no, I was really excited that the museum was doing an event like this, and now I know to look for these kinds of events at places like the Tenement Museum, and I think it's really nice to have a conversation across, different folks and then with people in the community. And I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about as somebody in academia is, so at Brown we have the Public Humanities program as part of our American Studies department, and we really think about what's the public, who is the public, how do you engage a public audience, and a lot of this is being done digitally, but I think museums and cultural institutions still play a really integral role. And I guess one question, which I don't have an answer to, but that I've been thinking about and have been reading a little bit about, is how do museums collect about particular movements that are ongoing and memorialize those movements as they're happening, because after the fact you might be like, we didn't have that, or we didn't get to talk to that person. And I know the National Museum of African American History and Culture has an article out of how they're working with the Black Lives Matter movement to collect and record and document some of the movement speeches and conversations and art posters and stuff. But I guess it's just something that I'm wondering about, because I think it's really important, and these ongoing conversations and relationships, and that if museums, collect the art of undocumented artists, or, have conversations and things like that, I think those are really important steps. So.
So I'll ask one more question, and then I want to make sure that the audience also has a chance to ask our panelists questions. And so my last question is, what are your suggestions for how folks can get involved locally to support the advocacy for immigrants in New York City and New York State? What to do?
I was still thinking.
Like, you can think of what to do and what not to do.
Do you have an answer? Do you want me to answer?
So the first thing that came to mind was coins. A biggest thing that we, right now, because of the jeopardy that DACA is in, organizations are collecting funds to do DACA renewals. So
And the fee is going to go up in like 2 weeks. So it's going to go almost $800 now. So.
right now we pay about $4.95, and it's supposed to go up to $7.65. So like, I don't have that right now. So there's like multiple people in this room. If we put like $10 together, I'm sure we could find something for like me or someone else who looks like me. So that's, I think that's the biggest thing for this moment right now. Overall, we need immigration policy in this country that reflects people who are coming, who are present, and who will adjust to permanent citizenship. Right now, our laws don't reflect anything realistic, anything that is really humane, and reflective of, again, how people migrate to this country or how people migrate across the world. So I think I'm a huge policy person, so I think this is where our immigration policy needs to go, where it should be, and how you can use your political power to make it happen. There is some commitments. There's already policy at the federal level, such as not the New York State. Oh my goodness. The Dream and Promise Act. What's great about the Dream and Promise Act is that it was led by immigrant organizations. Another part of it is that it links not only communities that we see at the border, but also folks who we see at airports, the folks we see at all of our ports. So it's taking into account that, yes, there are DACA recipients, but there's also TPS holders who've been here far longer than the DACA recipients. The largest populations of TPS holders are El Salvadorians, Haitians, and folks from Honduras. I think those are the top three, or make up some of the largest populations. But right now, the Dream and Promise would create a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients and young dreamers or young immigrants, TPS holders, and finally DED recipients who are deferred and forced departure. Deferred and forced departure is very similar to DACA in that it is at the president's discretion. And it creates a temporary pathway out of deportation for Liberian nationals. So it was created first because of the war that was going on in Liberia, and then subsequent disasters, issues with Ebola, is reasons why it was reiterated by past presidencies. The Dream or Promise would create a pathway for all three groups, and that's about 2.7 or 2.5 million people. That is not close to the 11 million documented people that we have, which is why we need to continue pushing beyond a Dream and Promise Act to comprehensive immigration reform. The problems that we have is rooted in that all of our immigration policy are specialized for status. And status is not a life. Status is temporary. My life is forever. So getting on board with a comprehensive immigration reform would be a great place to start politically.
I think locally, folks can for sure help fundraise for a lot of these needs that are going right now. Can leverage their access that they have. So we're always in need of space, conference room space, college space. You can request speakers and compensate them. You can donate your time and your skills to do something that will support the organizing that is happening. And you can plug into a lot of the local city organizing that's happening right now against gentrification in Brooklyn. That will tremendously impact immigrants who are also pushed out of our communities, anti-gentrification efforts going on in the Bronx as well, and the increased policing and surveillance that's happening in our city in collaboration with the MTA. That will also tremendously impact immigrants who depend on the city's subways to commute, to make a living, to sell churros, that we all benefit from, right? And so this interactions with police can lead to incarceration, can lead to detention and deportation. This is all how the system works, right? In New York City, a lot of our detention and deportation machine works through criminalization with police. And so being plugged in against a lot of these efforts will impact the lives of immigrants in our city as well, and will also be in solidarity with Black Americans who are also fighting against police brutality for years in our city as well.
One more quick plug-in. Support the workers' rights movement across the city. If you see a rat going up on the block, support that work, because it's also supporting immigrants and the general working industry in New York City.
All right, great. Audience members, do you have any questions for our panelists?
Anyone have a question?
Hi, could you, so I know there's a lot of things that are kind of possibly pushed or possibly threatened through the Trump administration, but can you talk a little bit about the ways that this, the public charge and the kind of threat that people could lose their social services because they're a liability to this country, and the ways that it's being kind of resisted in legislation or through your community organizing, or the ways that it's getting closer and closer to becoming a reality?
I don't know too much about the policies challenging it, but what I have seen is that just the threat of a public charge was enough to get folks to drop a lot of the services that they had, and that a lot of it was around food. Um, if it gets challenged in court or something happens that determines that it's okay for immigrants to get services, it was enough to get a lot of people to just drop the services that they needed. So, and there's just been a lot of misinformation too, I think, with even the question on the census about citizenship, like a lot of the narratives around fear is enough for folks to not even want to open the door for folks who are collecting information about the census. And that's questions that we get a lot, mostly from like parents that come into our space who are struggling to navigate a lot of these systems.
I don't have anything yet.
Yeah, no, I mean, the National Immigrant Integration Coalition, NIIC or NIC, was sending a lot of emails out about this and mobilizing people to call representatives and get in touch and kind of mobilizing a campaign. So I don't know a ton about it, but I know that they're definitely mobilizing people and getting folks involved. And I don't know if they have like a policy memo or something related to the issue, but I know they're very active on it.
I will say that for more information on public charge, you can go to NILC's website, the National Immigrant Law Center. They have a tab for public charge that explains exactly what it is and if it went into implementation. I'm not sure. I don't think it did, but they would have that information.
I think something related to like criminalizing poor people is that the increase in fees for immigration relief efforts is not only on DACA, it's on like everything else. And they also want to challenge folks who apply for fee waivers. If you meet like a poverty standard, right, you can apply for a fee waiver because some of these applications are like thousands of dollars, right? And so it feels like it's just all the things, right? The public charge, while also the fees, while also the fee waivers, while also like all these other things. So it's like this has been the last 4 years, everything against immigration all the time and immigrants all the time. So yeah, the increase in the fee waivers, I just remembered that it will also challenge folks getting the waivers for that.
So, gay marriage was implemented in 2012. It passed, and I'm just curious in your experiences with undocumented queer communities. Did folks in your community did they benefit from gay marriage?
Oh, sure. Yes. Yes, it did. What we were seeing, many folks were able to get their citizenship through. It was, and we're seeing a lot of folks who are able to adjust that way. But what their experience is the homophobia of the United States. So they're experiencing both the immigration machine and the LGBTQ machine of being otherized because of those things. So we have. I can think of one case where one family member is someone in the military, and his husband is unable to adjust right now. So it's as much as the opportunity to adjust exists now, it's still the same not the same administration, but we're still operating in a homophobic, xenophobic country. So at every level of the institution, you're going to experience those things, and it's been showing up in that way.
How do communities deal with folks being queer and also, you know, using gay marriage as a way of legalizing too. So.
Yeah, so the communities that I work with, we have an undocuqueer team, and a lot of the young people that I work with, I want to say have not been able to benefit from gay marriage, mostly because they are young folks that are not out to their families and or live in abusive homes. And if they were to be out, it wouldn't be safe. And if they were to marry, right, that would be like even worse. And so a lot of the young people that I work with, I don't think have necessarily seen the impact of gay marriage, and some folks are trans and feel like marriage was like the last thing on the justice spectrum that they wanted, right? And so it's been a little bit complicated because of those reasons. Mostly the young people that I work with, yeah, I don't know if they would see see marriage equality as like, okay, maybe I can adjust this way, because they're facing all this other violence to even get to that point. I don't know if that answered your question a little bit. Yeah.
I guess I just want to remind folks that it's actually pretty difficult to adjust through marriage, especially if you enter the country without inspection, because you face mandatory reentry bans. So you have to go back to the country and apply. And that's a huge risk. And some people are able to file for a hardship application to go around that process, but that's also a risk. So it is actually it can be quite difficult as a solution to adjustment.
I didn't necessarily pose it as a solution. It was more like, has it happened, and have they seen cases, and what was the reaction to the community, and how are they possibly, either celebrated, or how is their narrative brought into the circle of political activism, perhaps, right? So.
Yeah, I would just add that the folks that I had a chance to talk to and that identified as undocumented and queer talked about like adjustment through marriage, even people who identified as queer and people who didn't, that was a really straining conversation to have with your partner, and to say like, even if the partner is totally on board with like, let's adjust and we want to do this, it just adds a whole nother layer to how you navigate your relationship. And so that came up a lot in the conversations. It's like, I know my partner is really supportive, and this is a path to citizenship, and this would offer me, X opportunities, but that would change our relationship, and, how do we navigate that, and is it the right time, and all the circumstances. So I definitely heard that come up a lot, which I think folks brought that up quite a bit.
I think I wanted to add to that the power dynamics that exist, right? Citizenship status, I feel, needs to be in like the power and control wheel of domestic violence, because at least some of the queer folks that are in our space that were beneficiaries of marriage equality and adjusted and all these things, there was still this like dependency, abuse with a partner who held citizenship over their head, or their partner's families held citizenship over their head, or was like, are you just with me for the papers? Or it was a very like, it still felt like if I could have adjusted any other way, I would have done it that way. But this was the only way. So it's been, yeah, and that sucks, because you should just be happy to be able to get married, right? And it's all these other layers.
Well, actually, for the video, it's helpful.
Now it's pointed at me. Okay. You all are working really on the front lines, whether you're working with them on a day-to-day or researching it, but you're following this on a personal level. How do you take care of yourself? How do you make sure that you're taken care of? Because I can understand it's very draining, it's very demanding. Burnout is very easy, especially in the activism space. So I'm always curious about, how do you maintain hope? How do you take care of yourself in this as you continue to work in this space?
So I've learned to say no. Who would have thought? And I've tried to respect my weekends. I've tried to have work blocks, so I don't work until all hours of the night, which is really difficult when you have crisis all the time. Sometimes people hit you up in the middle of the night that something has happened, this emergency, that emergency. Asking for support and help has been challenging, but also a good thing. And on the personal, I binge a lot on Netflix. I've watched every Christmas movie already, almost every single show. I'm so serious. And then and I also like a lot of community care stuff. So doing things that aren't always tied to a political agenda has been nice. We have a potluck on Saturday that I'm really excited for, because like every time we come together, it's like all these policies and things, and sometimes it's just nice to be in community. And we have now a self-care space in our office that is supposed to be no workspace, so people can nap. I've napped on that couch so many times, watch movies, cry, paint. I think engaging in the arts has been helpful for me. So trying to either see movies or go to events, I try to find like free art things that happen in my community that I can support and participate in and heal from. And then I've connected with some like of these holistic spaces. I'm thinking specifically Minka in Brooklyn, Reciprocity by Union Square. They try to have free support, yoga or free meditation, counseling or community meals that folks can participate in, which has been helpful for me because I don't always have the money to pay for like these things, right? So that has been helpful.
Piggybacking on some of that, I feel like in my personal life, I try to, I make it important to have my chosen family present. And I say chosen family because a chosen family are the people that you meet that may not be blood, but are to you in a relationship like a family member. So I have like 6 people in my life that are like just my favorite people, and I try to see at least 1 or 2 of them every week. So I feel like that's what I do. Outside of my personal life, I think boundaries. Boundaries, just like boundaries are so important because not that, yes, they do separate and they act as borders, but you're able to see you're able to isolate where you are. You're able to measure better when you have things in bucket. That's what works for me, and it helped me figure out a path to say no. Saying yes a lot of times is something I developed being a youth organizer, feeling always the need to like, okay, you guys have done this work for me, I have to do this for you too. And I feel like a big part of the self-care that I'm learning now is untraining and learning that. So saying no to an interview and just going home and literally just going home and just getting out of the needing the mentality to always being a producing state of mind, and being an organizer has a way to really enable that, and I feel that's what I've been doing so far. So Netflix binging. I love to eat, so I watch a lot of tasty videos, like at 3 a.m. or like between 12 and 3 a.m. It's like tasty videos. That one South Asian dude who's like building houses houses out of mud and all these things. Like it's just like most of it is just like taking like tips for when like I can adjust and go home and do it. But like a lot of it is just like, wow, like this is person creating. It's just like it's a way of disassociating, I suppose. To just like see someone else doing for a change, and like just supporting that. Like you go, dude, building a house. Just like this little things like that. Y'all like follow me on Facebook. Like my Facebook is hilarious. Follow like YLC on Instagram because the memes. Oh my goodness. Like this is another like form of self-care. Like memes are amazing because they're the memes in the immigrant community so far. They're just like all the trauma, just like all of it. But at the same time, it creates and fosters. I'm so sorry. It fosters a sense of community together. That hey, we all in this this struggle, but like here's the white lady and the white cat meme. Like that's my favorite one right now. So like just like being engaged in my community with memes is another way. Yep.
Yeah, I guess I would say I love food, as like was just mentioned. Like food is really important, but also food for my community. So one thing that's really nice is just like getting food that's really like Vietnamese food or getting Bolivian food. Which there's some awesome spots in New York City, so I hope to do that while I'm here. But yeah, food. I think especially in the winter, it's cold, and I'm from California, so food makes me happy and warm at the same time. And then like I FaceTime with my family, and because they're far away and they're not able to visit California. And then I think one thing that's been, I mean, everybody talks about Trump and everybody talks about politics, and I agree it's important to be aware and updated. And I mean, being Bolivian and seeing what's happening to Bolivia in the news right now, it's like, I just want to be a person eating and smiling and talking to people. And so like seeing images or shows or things of POC, people of color, like being joyful and happy and vibrant and doing their thing. And so going to an art exhibit where it's like artists of color, or watching like all the Latinx shows on Netflix, and hearing Spanish spoken or hearing, other languages spoken, I think it's nice to kind of take pride in the vibrancy of community and the resilience of community when it's not always kind of the day-to-day.
Any other last thoughts? Because I think we're getting close to the end. Yeah. I want to thank the panelists for this wonderful exchange. If you want to join me in thanking them. And thanks to the Tenement Museum for hosting. And I guess, come and say hi, and we'll get out of the space.